Hi, I'm TJ Brown. I'm a professional archaeologist with advanced degrees in archaeology and peer-reviewed publications in journals across the world. And this is the Northwest Archaeology and History Project. We do cultural resource compliance work, assist with research, do research consulting with advanced methods, and provide training opportunities and do our own archaeological research. One of the principal goals, though, with what we want to do here at this organization is do a better job of providing people with scholarly, approachable, and professional-ish resources to learn about some of the most amazing history in the world, the archaeology of the Pacific Northwest. And I say ish, our research and work is quite professional. It's our video production and scripting that brings in the ish part of that. But yeah, what we want to do is through this, we also really want to do a better job of emphasizing how archaeologists turn data from scraps of little tiny scraps of artifacts like this and turn it into an understanding of history. And we want to do this for two main reasons. The first is that it's kind of science, especially historical science, where the process by which we come to understand something and what we get out of that process is often far more impactful than the result of an analysis itself. And I hope to make that clear the more we go through these episodes. And second, it's because of regulation. It's a weird way to put that. But the overwhelming majority of archaeology done in the United States and North America more generally is done under the auspices of federal and state level regulations. So what that means is that archaeologists are allowed the opportunity to go and record, excavate, preserve sites prior to their destruction through usually development. And that's a problem because in my experience in teaching and communicating to the public about archaeology, very few people know about these regulations. And that in and of itself isn't much of a problem. But fewer people can tell me one tangible thing that they have learned through these, learned about archaeology or history of the region because of the implementation of these regulations. And like I said, that's a big problem because the ability for me to do what I love and for the ability of, archaeology in general, we need the support of non-archaeologists. And that could either be whether that be through direct financial support, for example, please hire us or contribute directly to our organization so we can keep doing stuff like this. And also, just importantly, continued support in allowing for archaeologists to come in and do site recording, preservation, and excavation prior to the destruction of archaeological sites, because without that, we can't really study history. You need a lot of sites in archaeology. No matter how cool or big one site is, it's just one piece at one particular time of a civilization, and there's not a lot you can do with one piece at one time. So we really are dependent on support beyond the professional archaeological community, which is fairly small. And so what we want to do is demonstrate that this actually is cool and does have value and hopefully garner goodwill and support for people to allow us to continue to do this. We want you to get more out of it. And in turn, that allows us to do it. So with that said, ironically enough, this episode does not have much archaeology in it. Sort of. Yeah. Instead, our goal in this episode is to really introduce the Pacific Northwest as an archaeological study area and give some context and background for how civilizations here operated as they were recorded in the 1800s. However, if you don't need this, are well versed in the cultural and physical geography of the Pacific Northwest, or just fundamentally uninterested in it, please feel free to visit our other episodes, which are much more in-depth reviews of and analysis of archaeology in the region, split up by different time periods and places. So with that being said, what is the Pacific Northwest? So, as you can see here, the Pacific Northwest is the northwest portion of North America, which borders the Pacific Ocean. So, I'll see you next episode. We're all done. Just kidding. No, so the Pacific Northwest is that. It's the northwest part. And it traditionally is understood as ranging from up here in Southeast Alaska down to just south of the California and Oregon border. And to the east, the Rocky Mountains act as a good guideline for the general border or boundary of the Pacific Northwest study area. One of the things that's immediately apparent when I draw these things, though, is that the Pacific Northwest encompasses thousands of linear miles and hundreds of thousands of square miles. And within this, we see incredible ecological diversity across a short distance. For example, down here in Oregon, where I'm from, we can click here and see we have these temperate rainforests with impenetrable thick forest. And then just a short drive away, about an hour, give or take, we end up into this interior valley, which is an endless morass of swampy, which is where I live. And then we're just, again, a short couple-hour drive away to incredible deserts, steep and sized river ranges, as you can see here and here, as well as pine forests and wetlands with small rivers here. And all of this is within a few hours of each other. And this begs a question: if we have a huge amount of ecological diversity across a small area, and we cover such a huge area, why is the Pacific Northwest a thing? Why not make it multiple things? Well, that's a good question. And the reason for that is partly because of the time that it was done. Archaeologists back in the day made culture areas. But there's kind of a good reason why they did that. And that reason for the Pacific Northwest is that we're dealing with a variety of civilizations and cultures that shared a lot of features. For example, art styles. So you see a lot of shared symbology and geometric design and iconography in these art styles, as you can see in some of these examples of bowls, combs, utensils, etc. There's also a lot of economic integration among the societies here. So their economies fundamentally depend on each other. There's a lot of linguistic connections among peoples here that tends to be more related internally than it is externally, even towards direct neighbors at the borders. And then there's also a lot of shared religious beliefs, ceremonial ties, social events, etc., that really tie the Pacific Northwest together as sort of an entity as opposed to splitting it up more. So with that being said, a culture area is kind of a fake thing. It's not real. It's something archaeologists use as a shorthand to describe general trends. And in the Pacific Northwest, it kind of works because all these features mean that people interacted more towards the internally within the Pacific Northwest than they did with people externally. But it's important to not overemphasize when we talk about the Pacific Northwest as a, quote, culture area, that implies a sameness or contiguous recognition of culture throughout the region. For example, people at the far north and people at the far south, I promise, had very little idea of each other's existence, much less any day-to-day practices that they did. And indeed, outside of vague notions that they knew people up there and down there existed, they would never have considered themselves as some sort of coherent Pacific Northwestian culture. With that said, let's talk about who actually lived here. What are the civilizations of the Pacific Northwest like, at least in terms of the recent historic past? I like to start when talking about how civilizations operated here, I like to start with villages because they are intrinsic to how we see the world, how we interact with the world. Where we grew up has profound influence on what kind of cultural attitudes we're exposed to, what cultural influences we're exposed to, what jobs we're exposed to, even can set expectations for what relative status we can expect, what jobs to expect, etc. And just as that's true today, that's been true in the past. So to start with, what is a village? Which is actually a more complicated question than you would think. But it's just important to remember, a village is a primary place of residence that is relatively fixed. It does not necessarily imply that a place where you spend all or even most of your time. Until the very modern era, it was quite normal for people to spend enormous amounts of the year away from their home, away from their family, even years at a time. So in the Pacific Northwest, there was two kinds of villages. The first is a primary village, and the second is a secondary village or auxiliary village. In the literature, you'll see these referred to as a winter village or a summer, spring, fall village. I don't like to use seasonal designations because especially for winter village, these are places that were not only occupied in the winter, and there were places where the winter village was the only village, so it was just the village. Anyway, the primary winter village would be where you spend the winter, which is why it gets called the winter village. The auxiliary or secondary villages would usually be located next to key resource areas where you would move to during harvesting season, whether that be fishing or plants to harvest, what have you. And the amount of time you would spend at the winter versus the secondary villages, or whether you had a secondary village at all, is hugely dependent on where you lived and cultural attitudes, etc. And we'll get to that later because it's really interesting. But for right now, what did these villages look like? Well, I'm going to start on the coast because there's a lot of architectural and layout difference between the coastal civilizations and interior ones. On the coast, people live in plank houses, which quite descriptively means houses made out of planks of wood. As you can see, here and here, there's a lot of architectural variability and some general trends as they range from north to south. Is in the north, you get much more square houses that are much more heavily built and often would have these like sunken living room floors, like you would see like the 70s house construction. And then as you move down into the central coast, you got less use of these elaborate excavated, sunken interiors. And you would get these more lightly built, what they call shed roof houses. I guess they thought they looked like sheds. And then as you get towards the southern end of the central coast and the southern coast, you go back to what's called a gable house. And these are just, goes like this. So here's some examples here and here of kind of line drawings and actual pictures of recreations and paintings from the 1800s. And the houses of these structures could vary quite a bit. So small houses, 4 meters by 5 meters, or 13 by, 16, 17 feet. And then medium houses would be 8 by 15 meters, give or take. So, 25 by 50 feet. And on the larger end, you get houses even, 15 by 110 meters. So 50 by 340, 50 feet, something like that. And just as you saw, I'll go back to some of these pictures over here. I hope this gives the impression that these are monumental undertakings in terms of labor and raw materials. They're not expedient structures at all. In addition to these large houses, you would also see lots of auxiliary structures like storage facilities and workshops, processing areas, cooking areas, and you would also see boardwalks leading between houses or over places that were particularly muddy or not good for walking. In some areas, especially has been recorded on the west part of Vancouver Island, there was scaffolding to have boardwalks kind of over cliffs and edges and things like that. So these are very busy places. In terms of population, these villages ranged, as with everything. You'll hear me say that a lot. There's a lot of variability. On the small end, you're talking 50, 60 people. This average village, 200 to 400 people in a lot of cases. And then on the upper end, you have over 1,000 people recorded sometimes. Now, to put this into context, the town of Beaverton, where I live now, during the same time period, roughly the mid-late 1800s, had about 300 to 400 people. So in context, these towns were the same size or more populous than many rural towns that you would see in eastern United States at this time, as the Western was not United States yet. And that's not just me saying it. Even Lewis and Clark noted that the population density as they reached the Portland area exceeded anywhere that they had seen except for large urban centers back in the United States or the East Coast. And so I just want to give the impressions these are quite busy towns. They're populated and outside of major urban centers, which had far, far larger populations than anything we're talking about here, were commensurate with the size of villages and stuff you'd see in most other parts of the United States at the time. So for the interior villages, we see a lot of similarities. The population ranges are very similar, and you see a very similar kind of primary with secondary village orientation. The major difference that we see on the interior is an architectural one, where instead of plank houses, there were no plank houses. Let's say generally there was no plank houses on the interior. You would have what are called pit houses, mat houses, and what I like to call Pitty Matty mix houses. So pit houses, as I'll show here, are pretty much exactly as they describe. They are pits, and the walls of the pit form a substantial portion of the walls of your house. And then on top of this, as point out here, you'll have large construction or beams, what have you, over the top to form the roof. Mat houses, again, quite descriptive, are simply houses with structural supports, and around the structural supports acting as walls and roofing would be woven materials of bark, grasses, hide, what have you, anything. And then the pitty matty houses are kind of a mix. So you get more shallow excavations with superstructure on top, to form the support for walls of some kind of planking or woven material. Why don't we have plank houses on the interior? This is because of practicality. Primarily, so one, there's no trees for the most part. Well, there's no trees where you want to live, and the only place there are trees up in these mountains, you don't want to live because the winters are horrifying and cold and hard. And so moving large logs that you need to build a plank house, remember, I'm talking millions of board feet of lumber for a village, becomes impractical, especially with no industrial equipment. And for most of history, no pack animals like a horse, which only came through after the Spanish arrived in Mexico and California after the 1500s. So it's impractical to build a plank house, one reason. The second is that the interior winters are very, very cold and harsh relative to coastal winters. Coastal winters are very harsh in a different way, but their maritime climate means that they have a different kind of cold, and it doesn't get as cold. And seasonality is sort of averaged out a lot more on the coast. So in the interior, you're much more concerned with keeping warm and insulation through the winter, and that's where pit houses really do excel. In fact, they excel so well that in some studies, they found that body heat alone can keep people comfortable through pretty cold weather. And this need for efficiency is really exacerbated when you go back to me saying that there's no trees. So not only do you have bitter, bitter cold throughout huge portions of the year, you have very little fuel to burn to generate heat. And so creating a lot of efficiency is really important. So that's one reason pit houses. Now, I also mentioned two other kinds of structures. And generally speaking, these other two, the mat houses and the mat and pit mix houses, are more common the more south you go, especially as you start getting south of along the Columbia about here and here. And the reason for that is not totally known, but there's one reason why deep classic pit houses like that are less common. That's just soil is much shallower as you move south. So where shallow allows, you will see kind of these big, robust, deep excavated pit houses. But for the most part, those soils aren't as common in the southern part of this interior area. And so even if you wanted to build a pit house, you couldn't. So at least not how they did in the north. So that's why you built these kind of mix of structures. In the 1800s, it seems as though most people, not all, but most had gone completely to these mat houses. And the reason that many have suggested that's the case is because the spread of the horse, as well as huge endemic warfare at the time, made people kind of choose a type of housing that was very portable, could be carried on the back of horses. And that made sure that people were very mobile and able to not become victims of endemic warfare that was going on, both with other tribes in the area, as well as, depending on the exact time, 1850s, a series of protracted military conflicts with the United States military. So mobility was very important. And so being able to carry everything you need to reconstruct a village wherever you went with your horse probably was very important.